Hideo Kojima is obsessed with movies and Hollywood. He'd probably be the first to admit it. I mean, honestly, if you have any doubts, then just look at this side-by-side of Metal Gear Solid's intro next to Michael Bay's The Rock that came out 3 years earlier. Harry Gregson-Williams, who worked on this very soundtrack under Hans Zimmer, was then poached by Kojima to produce the music for the opening of MGS2. So you can have no doubt that Kojima was familiar with the scene. The thing is, we can dig into Kojima's lack of originality all we want, but it doesn't change how incredible the games were. In fact, in this case, it just highlights how his dedication to the sounds of cinema meant that from the very start, right through to the very end, the amazing artists who produced music under his direction succeeded where few had before in creating their own original work that actually rivaled Hollywood standards. Hideo Kojima was one of the earliest pioneers of integrating cinematic worlds, like this original piece of concept art from the film Blade Runner, into video games, like this hilariously traced shot from one of his early games, Snatcher. And this was driven far more by his yearning for a life in cinema than any kind of knowledge in video games, and so from his earliest days he satisfied his urges by cloning these iconic worlds, and the characters, and even the sequences, famously clashing with the coders at Konami due to lacking knowledge in everything from scheduling right through to memory allocation. His unrealistic goals often led to overrunning deadlines and budgets, with his early title Snatcher, with his jazzy cinematic soundtrack that you've just been listening to for the last minute, having its entire second half scrapped, which resulted in a cliffhanger ending. Through to his final title, The Phantom Pain, with its budget of 1,000 times the size, showcasing a comparable pattern. And while longtime fans hoping for a holistic resolution to the series were vocal in their disappointment, it has to be said that however much of a hit his narrative takes, the hands-on gameplay and cinematic presentation of his games would rarely be anything short of groundbreaking.
Gaining altitude.
Way back in the late 80s, Kojima made waves with the first Metal Gear game. The audio might sound repetitive by today's standards thanks to the limitations of the MSX2 sound chip, but what it did do was validate Kojima's decision to assign music tracks which could be triggered by specific scenarios such as sounding the alarm, and upon completing the event it would revert to the default music. And this was just one of many small steps toward immersion and went a long way to setting the game apart from other titles, and its popularity paved the way for Metal Gear's official sequel, Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, also on the MSX2, the game which in time would serve as both the prequel and the direct template for Metal Gear Solid. Having hit the ceiling for what the MSX2 sound chip could achieve, the team were authorized to make use of a chip developed by Toshiba specifically for Konami that got soldered onto the actual game cartridge and would allow for more synths to play simultaneously, freeing up the native sound chip to handle other things like drums or effects. Now you might think that this would be a godsend to the developers of the time, but of the dozen-odd Konami titles that made use of this chip for their games, few really featured audio that stood apart. Typical example being King's Valley 2, which is pretty much as boring as it is uninspiring. Now there were a couple of exceptions. For example, Tsuyoshi Sekito showed innovative use of the chip's extra depth for space mambo, such as layering music over sounds, going all in with cool bass lines. But as exciting as the sounds were, it would still be hard to place the audio down the line if separated from the visuals. And then Sekito fell under Kojima's direction, and so how did he and members of Konami's Kukeya Club harness the power of the chip in order to create the music for Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake? Well, I'm glad you asked. Kojima's vision was to emulate Hollywood, we know that, and so that is what they gave him. And bear in mind that this was made in the late 80s. It wasn't some Stranger Things throwback to a beloved bygone period. They were actually working on it over the same couple of years that Predator and Die Hard came out. So if you pick up an 80s vibe, that's legit. And so to start off with, Snake gets his own upbeat theme tune. And this is used to introduce us to the game and the titular character. As the adventure begins, the gameplay is predominantly stealth-driven, and so progression into the mysterious compound is matched, like for like, as with this Rambo-inspired tribute that spells sneakiness and intrigue. As the game advances, it does pick up pace, and with it so does the soundtrack, taking on cantering beats reminiscent of 80s bands like Iron Maiden that were peaking at the time. And along with a number of other catchy tunes, it carries us through the midsections and beyond. And then there's the game's main theme, the ubiquitously named Zanzibar Breeze, which delivers an undeniably catchy melody that is surprisingly hard to shake after you've heard it play out enough times. Is just such an epic soundtrack for the time. Every year, improving technology would further close the gap between games and his beloved medium of cinema. With each new title, he was better able to direct his team to emulate production methods typically consigned to film, and this evolved into a level of fidelity in his games that, along with goofy worlds and narratives, would come to be unmistakable to fans and critics alike.
There's a special quality that you just sort of feel in his art. I know it's a lot of people doing a lot of work, but it's really, you can see Hideo Kojima's fingerprint on this.
With the music in particular, there is simply no denying that under Kojima's visionary direction, Konami's musical artists would produce some of their finest work. Now, not all of Konami's best work was under his direction, obviously. For example, Silent Hill, which was released a year after Metal Gear Solid, was also lauded for its original soundtrack that greatly enhanced the tone of a game. However, creator Kiichiro Toyama worked on Kojima's early title Snatcher more than 10 years before Silent Hill was released, and the composer Akira Yamaoka had himself worked on enhancing the music to Snatcher for the PC release 5 years earlier. Did Kojima write the tunes in his games? No. Is it coincidence that every single game he's ever directed had an absolutely killer soundtrack? No. He loves cinema. Cinema loves a good soundtrack.
Ergo, Latin.
Ergo, indeed, Kojima loves a good soundtrack. And clearly so did the other game makers at Konami who built on Kojima's success after they'd seen him put his job and reputation on the line repeatedly and proved that it could be done. Now, to be clear, plenty of other iconic games, like say The Legend of Zelda, which Shigeru Miyamoto brought to the market before anybody had even heard of Metal Gear, would establish the value of a catchy theme tune. Kojima did not pioneer having good tunes in his games, obviously. In fact, the Zelda theme was so good that it still gets cameo appearances in the series to this day.
Interesting. I look forward to meeting you.
And then over on the Sega Mega Drive, we had things like Streets of Rage that was giving me goosebumps as far back as 1992. But catchy or not, you serve to construct a scene like the dynamic soundtracks of Metal Gear. Janky or simplistic as the tracks might sound in retrospect, that was due to the limitations of the technology, and so the artistic brilliance of the artists who made them should not be understated. But while Kojima would be harnessing the Hollywood style of self-promotion by plastering his name all over the title screen and reaping the benefits of a die-hard fan base. The truth is, no one was really taking video games seriously until relatively recently, so despite some of these artists being incredibly important pioneers who lifted the industry up on their shoulders so it could evolve into the colossus that it is now, without some pretty deep digging, it can be a challenge to even find some of their names. Now, this is far from the only reason that some of the best musicians' names have dropped off the radar, but it is hard to ignore the fact that with just a little scrutiny, it becomes clear that Kojima would often treat the title screen as a gimmick. The sequences might have looked legit, but really they just played out more like a tribute to Hollywood movies, where he would select the names to promote who he saw fit, instead of assigning screen time fairly to the relevant artists most deserving of the credit. Now, don't get me wrong, Hollywood is every bit as miserly with the screen credits, famously so, but for that very same reason, the film industry has agents and unions who fight tooth and nail to ensure artists get their due. Case in point being the use of Harry Gregson-Williams' name on the opening screen of Metal Gear Solid 2.
悩んだんですが、リプレイスメントキラーというを、聞いて、この人を使いたいなということがありまして。
Gregson-Williams had just gained notoriety for his work on Michael Bay's The Rock under Hans Zimmer, and so Kojima brought him in to create the music for the cutscenes, which, in turn, certainly gave the opening cinematics that je ne sais quoi sound that really made it feel like a current Michael Bay movie. And the thing is, aside from a few ad hoc bits, that's really all that he did, and so plastering his name over the opening credits was in truth a marketing flex that shunned the actual musicians behind the soundtrack.
So it is the Kasaka.
Rika Muranaka, who composed The Haunting, The Best Is Yet to Come, does get a brief flash, and Kazuki Muraoka also gets a mention, considering he oversaw the mind-bending sounds and music for the entire series. But there's no mention of the game's actual composer, Norihiko Hibino, best known for his sweet sax motifs and a wide range of in-game soundscapes that played a huge part in defining the overall game's vibe. For example, when Raiden wears stolen fatigues inside the hostage room, clanking industrial sounds and minimalistic soundtrack keeps things serious. But don the sneaking suit once more, and back come the orchestral strings and immortal funky sax riffs. Which, whether you realise it or not, are responsible for affirming that cosy and wholesome cinematic tone that defines the light-hearted gameplay. And it's hard to ignore the irony of the fact that these names presented on the opening sequence are all bolstered by the incredible theme created by Tappy Iwasawa, whose name is also nowhere to be seen. But considering that most gamers aren't familiar with any of the names that they're going to see on the titles, it allowed Kojima to promote whoever suited him at the time. Unfortunately for Tappy, if being the composer for the iconic main theme wasn't enough to claim a title spot, then once MGS4 came out in 2008, it was all over for him. And the reason for this was because while promoting the game, Russian journalists pointed out to Kojima that Tappy had repurposed a decades-old piece of music from a fairly well-known Russian composer, Yorki Sverridov. I wanted to show a large sample, but as I just pointed out, somebody's pretty protective of this song, so another second of it gets me a copyright breach, but you can take it from me, it's pretty amusing how similar they are. Now, I've been humming this song in the shower since I was 13 years old, so I can't fathom anything else in its place. But while Tappy was following Kojima's lead and surreptitiously borrowing from the works of established artists, Hibino was hard at work building an entire library of original music that defined the entire game's tone, and would continue to do so for the sequels, going so far as to rearrange Gregson-Williams' music to match some of the cutscenes.
I was amazed that of the skill at which someone in Japan, in Konami somewhere, has taken all the music that I wrote and somehow made it work with the pictures.
Freeze! Hands over your head, now!
Yet he wasn't Hollywood grade like Gregson-Williams, nor aspiring to be Hollywood grade like Kojima was, and so left off. Having proven himself on MGS2 and gained some clout internally, Hideo was then recognised on the next Metal Gear title that he worked on, both composing and remixing audio. That was apparently enough to get his name on the titles, but you do have to ask, why did he have to have an entire game in the bag first? Maybe it's because he simply submitted to Kojima's will by putting down his saxophone and instead taking on a heavy dose of influence from a certain movie franchise that Kojima held in very high regard. Diluting his own brand of sound was something that was, well, certainly fun, but far, far less original. Pretty sure you can guess which franchise it is, and this time around Kojima didn't even try denying it. And so, in 2008, with Metal Gear Solid 4's release date closing in, once the revelation had been made, despite the fact that Svedidov actually died the same year that Tabi used the tune, Konami's lawyers insisted they expunge everything that contained even a sample of it from the Metal Gear library, which included various songs from the first 3 game soundtracks through to Poliga's appearance from Super Smash Bros. Last Minute. Gregson-Williams had been working on the supporting soundtrack of MGS4 for some time, and so the majority of the game still benefited from the usual deep horns and fast-paced strings the fans had become accustomed to. And while it still did include a solid range of evocative Hollywood-grade tracks,
Snake.
there was no getting away from the fact that now Metal Gear Solid 4 would be the only entry that was missing that memorable theme tune that would get stuck in your head, or if you heard somebody humming it on a bus or whatever, it would make you smile because you'd know exactly where it came from. And so the team scrambled for a replacement, and Kojima settled on a dubiously unoriginal piece by Gregson-Williams that was so similar to his work on The Rock with Hans Zimmer that I'm surprised they didn't get sued again. Maybe because nobody notices it's so forgettable and denied MGS4 of its own iconic jingle.
That's too bad. Because I'd hate to have to continue persuading you like this, comrade.
The PSP's impressive but underplayed portable ops was a rare success outside of Kojima's direct control, and the first title to expand the MGS universe while shrinking down the package, which is a pretty apt description for Kazuma Januki's punchy but focused title music that presumably wouldn't overload the PSP's meager sound system. The simplified gameplay was unavoidable, but the soundtrack faced fewer limitations, with jazz maestro Norihiko Hibino once more bringing the funk. As well as this, musician Akihiro Honda showcased his talent for integrating foreign sounds to enhance the game's worldly vibe. 2 years after Metal Gear Solid 4, and 4 years after its PSP predecessor, Portable Ops, Kojima helmed Peace Walker on the handheld device, and with its ambitious and vastly expanded scope, it was Akihiro Honda from the previous team who was the man tasked with producing a tune worthy of being labelled as the main theme, and seemingly, I think he pulled it off. What do you reckon? As well as this catchy motif, the rest of the soundtrack also incorporated a lot of classical guitar.
But it's all over. We lost our cacique.
Thanks to the Costa Rican setting, and this marked a positive change in direction for the game's music, which some argued had started to sound a little bit stale due to Gregson-Williams' continued reliance on the iconic 90s sounds that he'd built his career on. In fact, this particular rendition by the City of Prague Philharmonic Orchestra was chosen to play on the Phantom Pain deployment screen, which was pretty apt because they were both Big Boss titles. Now, I hate to ask, but if you could do me a solid, like or better yet subscribe, I would be eternally grateful, as just a little click from you is a massive win for me. Right, back to the video. As I was saying, because Kojima secured a whopping $80 million and 3 years to make the Phantom Pain, he was finally in a position to allow his team the breathing space to get creative, with Gregson-Williams taking on a producer role and presiding over a number of different artists, who between them would build on the traditional horns and strings to introduce a range of new styles that would invoke different tones throughout the game's runtime. For example, the theme of the game was supposed to be more grounded and human, so Ludwig Forsell scaled back the epic grandeur to make way for evocative piano medleys. Justin Burnett used bassy synths and grinding sounds of electronica to support the intimidating retro Metal Gear whenever it made an appearance. Daniel James injected the complex and unmistakable sounds of blockbuster extravaganzas. And Akihiro Honda, the guy behind the Peace Walker theme, was brought back into the fold with the goal of composing yet another iconic medley. Something that if you closed your eyes would instantly bring forth visions of Big Boss. Well, at least I think that was his brief, but considering Quiet would hum the tune as a sort of trigger warning every time she was about to take advantage of the game's M rating, I'm not sure if it was actually Big Boss who most players would end up associating with the theme. Naughty girl. Oh, yes. Oh, what a living. Ludwig Forsell, noted earlier for his piano medleys, would team up to write the lyrics, and perhaps the most interesting addition to the team was vocalist and voice actress Donna Burke. And I say interesting because if you've played the game, then you'll actually be very familiar with her voice.
Enemy presence detected. The map has been updated.
But that certainly wasn't the only time her voice would become synonymous with the game, as the main hook of the theme tune was her crying vocals. These would play out every time you used your Phantom cigar to fast forward time. Donna is a particularly interesting Metal Gear musician because her history with Konami has long kept her associated with various MGS royalty. Go 2 decades back when you would find her voicing the fan favourite Silent Hill 2 character Angela Orozco.
Mama, why are you running away?
You might find her in photographs with people like the now infamous Jeremy Blaustein, the brilliant English translator who fell foul of Kojima's climb to stardom. See my video on when Kojima burned his voice actors for his tragic tale. Or more recently, you might find her sharing her home with friend and Quiet actress Stephanie Jewston, who, interestingly, actually told a similar tale when Kojima conducted a personal video call with her and offered her a role in his upcoming game Death Stranding.
Oh, fragile.
Right.
And then gave it to a Hollywood starlet instead and didn't bother telling her.
Want to come work for me? Must be tough out here on your own.
I think we can all appreciate that that's showbiz for you, but considering his tendency to blur the line between being a producer tasked with meeting his financial obligations and an adult fanboy trying to sneak under the barrier, most fans generally consider his treatment of Jewston in particular not to have been one of his finest moments. Speaking of Jewston, when the Phantom Pain rightfully won Best Action Adventure Game at the 2015 Game Awards, Kojima's falling out with Konami led to their lawyers banning his attendance, much to the irritation of showrunner Jeff Keighley, who, as a long-time advocate for Kojima, publicly stoked the flames.
Mr. Kojima had every intention of being with us tonight, but unfortunately he was informed by a lawyer representing Konami he would not be allowed to travel to tonight's awards ceremony to accept any awards.
In a show of defiance, they invited Stephanie over from Japan, where she then stood in front of an audience of thousands to serenade the vindicated Kojima.
Saved my soul.
and shortly after this, he offered her the role.
So beautiful.
Kojima had every right to collect the award for Best Action Adventure, there's no arguing that, but despite the 2-hour show placing equal focus on a dozen different categories, look how much time Jeff Keighley then dedicates to Justin Burnett, Ludwig Forssell, Daniel James, Akihiro Honda and Donna Burke, amongst others, who were responsible for the Phantom Pain collecting its only other industry-leading award that night.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. That was for you, Hideo. We're thinking of you. All right, Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain is also our winner for Best Score Soundtrack tonight. So congratulations to team on that. Before we move on,
and we're talking about an industry-leading accomplishment here. This is not some small fry awards night. Well, somebody's segment needed to be cut so that Keighley could go on a rant about Konami, and who cares about musicians, right? Well, maybe Kojima, as he loves his soundtracks and his team often speak fondly of him, so I can only presume he feels the same way about them. And with over 2 hours of title sequences, I can't believe he wouldn't have found space to slot these musical heroes in somewhere, so let's whip through the credit sequence and go name hunting. 1 point for each time we spot the main man himself. Alrighty, well, we knew we'd start off with Koji, so there he is, and 2 and 3. Okay, starting off with some big names, and there's Donna, but that's a vocal credit, so that's not quite what we're after. Alright, how do we work this thing? Don't stop too early, but ouch, look at that! Snake sculpted buttocks. Kojima might as well have signed the screen. Alright, it's a bit of a murder fest. And then we escape. Oh yeah, and then this bit, flying things, the fire, and bang! Take a breather, and then, of course. To be fair, there's been quite a lot of action by this stage, so we might have forgotten who was responsible for all the fun we're having. However, having studied the code of Kojima, with a solid 6 credits in the bag, I think it's a safe bet he might be ready to start handing out some scraps. It actually makes sense if you think about it, because if he makes it look like other creatives actually mucked in and helped him make the game or whatever, it makes the whole thing seem more authentic, doesn't it? Alright, yes, Justin Burnett. He actually appeared above Hans Zimmer, Gregson-Williams. Nice. 1 down. Okay, Ludwig, nice, that's 2. Okay, so Hideo produced it, that's good to know. Good to know. Oh, he directed it too, which makes sense. Oh, okay, so that's the end of the first segment. But to be fair, in Peace Walker, it took like half an hour before we got around to seeing Akihiro Honda's name, and Kojima does love to draw these things out, so let's just push past the first mission. Pretty sure there's another credit sequence right after. Okay, here we go. This is it. Okay, well, it appears like 10 people wrote it, and 6 of those people were Hideo Kojima. As long as we understand that all writers are equal, but some are more equal than others.
What should I do? Tell me. Tell me like you used to.
That's right, Hideo. Tell us like you used to. Give us a hidden meaning or something. Something really subtle. Yeah, I was kidding, bro. We know you made the whole game yourself. Oh, that's a bummer. Maybe these guys didn't get credited. Or maybe he just divided them up into which mission their music featured in. That makes sense. Hang about.
Looks like we found him.
Oh yeah, S-rank baby. Nothing casual about the way we play this game. Okay, I won't lie, I think I'm starting to see a pattern here. Yeah, I don't think we're crediting anymore. It seems like we've circled back round and now we're cementing the credits which we think are most awesome. Maybe they're in a different level? Yeah, I'll give up. As you can imagine, I didn't actually bother counting beyond this stage, considering his name appears once at the start and 4 times at the end of approximately 50 missions, plus the prologue and the end credits of the game. That is upwards of 500 times that his name appears on screen. But he ran out of screen time for all the composers, apparently. I'm just focusing on the composers as a matter of principle in this video, but there were quite a few other creatives at that. The reality is, Konami have only ever focused on the bottom line, meaning various elements of the game that could or should or would have received screen time instead have not. As a result, Kojima had to fight for a lot of different things over the years, ranging from content to budgets and manpower. And it is so easy to blame the person at the top of the pyramid, but the contractual obligations of an enterprise like Konami rarely meet the moral obligations of the artists or indeed the consumer. And the distracted mind of a game director who is both trying to promote his craft while battling his sponsors will invariably lead to names that in hindsight should have rightfully been included. It really is that simple, with title credits often being treated like currency, asking for an additional name almost like a favour, and the energy necessary to fight for one or more artists' names to be on screen instead would be spent on leveraging budget or time to squeeze in finishing touches. And this is especially common in toxic work environments, as Konami is reputed to have been, and even more so when the pursuit of perfection meant that the team would be crunching at the 11th hour for almost every title. This doesn't, however, explain why Kojima rammed his own name into the game so many times that it's almost comical. I'm not the first person to take the piss out of how many times Kojima stuffed his name into the Phantom Pain credits, and I won't be the last. But here's the craziest thing. There is actually a possible caveat to this. I'm pretty damn certain I know exactly why he did it. And while I'm sure I can't possibly be the only person that's clocked onto it, it does factor in some niche knowledge, and I've never heard anyone else bring it up. So if you want to know what Kojima did to kick Konami in the proverbial ballsack, I'm working on the video now, and when it's done, it'll appear right here. Subscribe and hopefully you'll see it in your feed. The rest of the story is actually pretty juicy. If not, I hope you enjoyed the video so far, and thanks for watching. Take care of yourself, and hopefully see you next time.